really build on that relationship. And I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that, no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
Imagine a world in which the economic storm that began in Washington suddenly changed direction and struck not America's enemies, but America itself, where tariffs designed to protect jobs in Detroit and Pittsburgh became the catalyst for an industrial boom in Toronto and Hamilton, where a country that had stood in the shadow of its southern neighbor for decades suddenly came to the fore and turned a trade war into an opportunity for economic revival. This is the story of how Canada responded to American tariffs not with complaints, but with action, and how that response changed the map of North America.
Well, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
When President Donald Trump announced a new wave of tariffs, he promised to bring jobs back to the U.S. and force its neighbors to respect American labor. But within a few months, it became clear that the consequences were quite different. Companies began to close factories, investors left, and production chains collapsed. And while the White House assured citizens that these were temporary difficulties, Ottawa was preparing a move that would overturn the economic logic of the entire continent. At the beginning of the year, Canada announced the launch of a massive $5 billion industrial program, the largest economic project since World War II. At first glance, it looked like a defensive measure against American tariffs. But in reality, it was a challenger declaration that the era of dependence on the US was coming to an end. While Washington was building walls, Ottawa decided to build a future.
They don't allow our banks. Did you know that? Canada does not allow banks to go in.
Factories that had recently been on the verge of closure restarted their furnaces. Workers returned to their jobs, and engineers returned to their research laboratories. The steelworks in Hamilton lit up again, Sorel Tracy began taking orders for Europe, and Quebec City created new armored vehicles for the first time without American components. Everything that was supposed to weaken Canada made it stronger. But that was only the beginning. The government went further, announcing a second phase, a program to create new industries. High-speed trains, small nuclear reactors, satellites over the Arctic. Research centers in Montreal and Vancouver, Canada was not just defending itself, it was on the offensive. Against the backdrop of closed borders and protectionism in the United States, it opened its doors to scientists, engineers, and investors from around the world. Within a few months, international corporations began moving their branches to Toronto and Calgary, and the country that had previously been considered a quiet neighbor became a magnet for capital and ideas. The inflow of foreign investment grew at a record pace, and for the first time in decades, Canada began to dictate the rules of the game.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Today, many analysts call what is happening the Canadian miracle. The economy is growing, exports are breaking records, and investor confidence has reached an all-time high. And all this is not in spite of American pressure, but because of it. How did the trade war conceived in the White House lead to an industrial renaissance in the North? Why has Canada managed to change its place in the global economy right now? And could its success mark the beginning of a new era for all of North America? Our investigation explores these questions. The trade war that unfolded at the beginning of Donald Trump's second term was not just another round of economic sanctions between neighbors. It turned into the largest political and economic experiment in North America in recent decades. When the White House announced a new wave of tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and wood, it was presented as a step toward restoring justice and bringing jobs back to Americans. The president gave speeches about the need to put America first, accusing trading partners of unfair advantage. But behind the confident statements lay panic. The U.S. industrial belt had been losing ground for many years, and instead of reviving, manufacturing continued to move abroad. In these circumstances, Washington decided that putting pressure on its neighbors was a way to breathe life into dying factories.
And that we take good note of what they're saying. So it's not as if what the Secretary of Commerce has mentioned.
We compete. There are areas where we compete, and it's in those areas where we have to come to an agreement that works. But there are more areas where we are stronger together, and that's what we're focused on. And we're going to get the right deal for America, right deal, obviously, from my perspective, for Canada.
At first, the effect seemed successful. Domestic companies reported an increase in orders, and Trump's ratings in industrialized states rose. But this was the calm before the storm. After a few months, analysts began to notice alarming trends. Higher tariffs led to rising raw material prices within the US, and the production chains that had linked American and Canadian factories for decades began to collapse. Car manufacturers in Detroit faced a shortage of components, construction companies complained about a shortage of metal, and small businesses began to lose contract. Europe and Asia immediately seized the moment. German and South Korean companies began to intercept American orders by offering more stable conditions. Canada, which had long seen itself as the junior partner in the North American alliance, found itself at the epicenter of the shock. Exports of steel and aluminum to the US, which were the backbone of entire regions, plummeted. In the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, thousands of workers were at risk of losing their jobs. However, unlike previous crises, when Ottawa limited itself to diplomatic notes and cautious negotiations, this time the response was swift. The government understood that if it did not respond decisively now, its dependence on its southern neighbor would become permanent. And so a plan was born that Western journalists would later call the Canadian Revolution. The Ministry of Industry and Finance prepared a draft emergency industrial fund of $5 billion. Officially, it was to compensate for losses from tariffs. Unofficially, it was to create a new economic architecture. Details leaked out while the document was still being discussed in Parliament, and newspapers called it a manifesto of independence. The slogan uttered by the Prime Minister during a press conference became a symbol of the era. If America builds walls, we will build the future. The idea was not to beg the White House for concessions, but to stop playing by its rules.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
The plan consisted of 3 stages: protect, create, and attract. The first stage, protection, was intended to stabilize industry. The second, creation, was intended to restart technological potential. And the third, attraction, was intended to turn Canada into a center of attraction for capital and mines. But at that moment, all attention was focused on the first step, protecting national interests. The Protect program was a signal to businesses that the government was ready to take action, not just talk. The fund provided direct subsidies to businesses affected by tariffs, especially in the steel and aluminum industries. The city of Hamilton, where mass layoffs had been planned not long before, suddenly received dozens of new orders. Factories that had been closed during the pandemic years began to smoke again. In Sorel-Tracy, on the banks of the St. Lawrence River, production lines were modernized for export contracts to Europe. Whereas these companies had previously supplied parts to the United States, they now worked for France and the Netherlands. Particular attention was paid to the defense industry. After a series of meetings with military departments, a decision was made to launch a project to develop a new line of armored vehicles for the Arctic Command. All parts were to be manufactured domestically, without American components. This decision caused irritation in Washington, where it was called hidden protectionism. But Canada saw it differently. For the first time in many years, the country could provide for its own armed forces.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
At the same time, the government took measures to protect the domestic market. A new clause was added to the public procurement system. All other things being equal, priority would be given to Canadian companies. This gave a boost to small and medium-sized enterprises, which had been losing tenders to multinational corporations for decades. In 6 months, the number of applications from domestic manufacturers grew by almost 40%. In some regions, such as southern Ontario, cooperatives of small contractors began to form, joining forces to participate in large infrastructure projects. The media actively picked up on the wave of national enthusiasm. Headlines such as "Buy Canadian, Save the Future" appeared on billboards and in advertising campaigns. Sociologists noted an interesting effect. Whereas patriotic rhetoric in economics had previously been perceived as populism, it had now become part of everyday thinking. People were actually choosing locally produced goods, and businesses were proud of this.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Along with real successes, the situation was becoming overgrown with rumors. Some analysts claimed that a secret working group was allegedly operating in Ottawa, analyzing the weak spots of the American economy. It was said that it was this group that proposed the idea of mirror tariffs, but with a twist. Instead of punishing its neighbors, Canada was directing funds to support its own enterprises. Other sources claimed that the military was lobbying for a shipbuilding revival project in Halifax, believing that the US could restrict the supply of parts for the fleet. These stories were never officially confirmed, but they added to the sense of a hidden strategy, as if Canada were playing a quiet, calculated game against a giant confident in its infallibility. The international reaction was unexpected. European officials welcomed Canada's determination and began offering new trade agreements. In London and Berlin, there was talk that Ottawa had joined the adult club of industrially independent powers. At the same time, criticism in the US intensified. Some senators accused Canada of betraying the economic union, and the American media published articles about the Northern Rebellion. But the louder Washington's rhetoric became, the more confident the voices in Toronto and Montreal sounded. By the end of the first year of the Protect program, Canada's economy had shown unexpected results. Industrial production had grown by almost 4%, and unemployment in industrial regions had fallen to its lowest level in a decade. Against the backdrop of American protests and declining investment, it seemed almost miraculous. Financial publications wrote about the Canadian phenomenon, and international agencies raised their confidence ratings for the country.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began at the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
All of this became the basis for the second stage CREATE. If Protect was defense, then CREATE turned into offense. The government decided not just to hold its ground, but to use the crisis as a springboard. Large-scale investments in infrastructure, technology, and energy were announced. Projects that had been gathering dust in offices for years received funding. Among them were the construction of a high-speed railway between Toronto and Quebec City, the creation of a network of factories for the assembly of small modular nuclear reactors, and a satellite surveillance program for the Arctic. These initiatives symbolized a change in philosophy. Whereas Canada had previously seen itself as part of the American manufacturing circuit, it was now building its own ecosystem. Universities received grants for the development of artificial intelligence and quantum technologies, while private businesses received tax breaks for the development of new solutions. Clusters began to form in Montreal and Vancouver, miniature copies of the American DARPA, where engineers, military personnel, and entrepreneurs worked together on defense and civilian projects. The press wrote that, for the first time in a long time, Ottawa had stopped looking south for approval. Now it was dictating its own rules. Defense turned into creation, and defense turned into offense. And although many skeptics assured that without US support such a strategy was doomed, the first results proved the opposite. New businesses were opening faster than old ones were closing, and private investment grew by a third.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
The trade war, conceived as a tool of pressure, turned into a catalyst for industrial revival. Canada not only weathered the storm, it learned to use the crisis as fuel for growth. And while the White House argued with its allies about the fairness of tariffs, its northern neighbor quietly, step by step, created a new economy self-sufficient, technologically advanced, and independent. When the first successes of the Industrial Protection Program became apparent, the atmosphere in Canada changed almost imperceptibly, but decisively. The country felt as if, after decades of dependent existence, it had finally taken a deep breath. If at the beginning of the crisis Ottawa acted out of defensive considerations, now there was increasing talk of an offensive. The second phase, codenamed CREATE, was not just a logical continuation of the industrial turnaround, it became an ideological revolution. For the first time in many decades, Canada did not look south when making decisions that could change the entire balance of power in North America. The main principle of the new course was CREATE, don't wait. After the launch of the Protect program, there was growth in industry, but the government understood that this was not enough. It was necessary to turn the temporary revival into a long-term strategy. That's when a plan for a large-scale technological leap forward emerged: modernization, innovation, autonomy. Whereas Canada had previously supplied resources and components, it now had to become a source of new technologies itself.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
It all started with infrastructure. In the corridors of Parliament, there was talk of a project that would later become a symbol of a new era: the construction of a high-speed railway between Toronto and Quebec City. The project had been discussed 10 years earlier, but now, in the face of political challenges, it was given the green light. Officially, the government wanted to connect the country's largest economic centers. Unofficially, it wanted to demonstrate its ability to implement large-scale projects without American participation. The construction was accompanied by unprecedented conditions. All rails, cables, and safety systems had to be manufactured exclusively in Canada. This decision sparked a storm of criticism from foreign suppliers, but within the country it became a source of pride. At the same time, work began in the energy sector. Projects to create small modular nuclear reactors, which had been discussed at the beginning of the crisis, moved into the practical implementation stage. A pilot reactor running on recycled fuel was approved in Darlington, and sites for the serial production of such facilities began to be prepared in Alberta and New Brunswick. Several independent media outlets reported that one of the first reactors had been tested with results exceeding expectations and had become a source of energy for an entire industrial cluster. This was presented as a symbol: a country that had previously depended on external sources was now exporting energy and technology itself.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Particular attention was paid to the defense and technology sector. Research centers were set up in Montreal and Vancouver, which journalists unofficially called Canadian DARPA. There, engineers and students worked on projects in the fields of artificial intelligence, satellite systems, and quantum computing. The government did not disclose the details, but leaks indicated that one of the projects involved the development of autonomous navigation systems for icebreakers and underwater vehicles designed to protect the northern borders. This was not just a defense solution, it was a symbol of strategic independence.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
For the first time in a long time, Canada became a country where industry, science, and politics were moving in the same direction. Universities saw a growing number of programs related to engineering, robotics, and clean energy. The state invested millions in education, understanding that an industrial breakthrough was impossible without an intellectual base. Some economists ironically said that Canada had finally ceased to be a northern farm and had become a laboratory of the future. But the real turning point was how business responded to this momentum. Whereas companies had previously been afraid to take risks, waiting for signals from the US, private investment now began to grow. Financial reports showed growth in investment in research and development, especially in the fields of green energy and mechanical engineering. In some sectors, investment grew by a third, and private venture capital funds began to actively finance startups working in the field of renewable energy and artificial intelligence.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Against the backdrop of protectionism and the closed nature of the American economy, the Canadian model seemed like a breath of fresh air. Visa restrictions were tightening in Washington, companies were complaining about the unpredictability of tax policy, and Ottawa was doing the opposite. Soon, this policy was formalized in the form of a third stage attract. While the first two stages strengthened the domestic economy, the new task was to attract the attention of the whole world to Canada. The Talent North and Campus Canada programs became the heart of this strategy. The state introduced simplified procedures for engineers, researchers, and students from Europe, India, and Southeast Asia. Universities received additional funding, and businesses received tax breaks for hiring graduates. Within 6 months, international agencies recorded a record increase in applications for Canadian visas. A particularly strong influx came from the US, where new restrictions on foreign workers deprived tens of thousands of specialists of Seychelles of the opportunity to stay. Canadian companies did not miss the chance. New development centers opened in Toronto, Calgary, and Ottawa, ranging from IT corporations to energy startups.